August 1945. The Pacific is a clinical graveyard of ambition. On islands like Tinian, Saipan, and Guam, hundreds of Boeing B-29 superfortresses sit in gleaming rows. They are the most advanced machines ever built by man. They are the silver plate bombers. These are the only instruments capable of delivering the atom bomb to a target. The development program cost $3 billion. In today's currency, that is a surgical investment of $50 billion. It costs more than the Manhattan Project itself. The bomb was a $2 billion secret. The plane was a $3 billion reality. In the dialect of the 1940s, this was the ultimate billionaire's handshake, a weapon so advanced it forced an empire to its knees without a single American boot touching the Japanese mainland. It was the absolute peak of aeronautical engineering. But as the smoke clears over Nagasaki, a cold arithmetic emerges. Victory has rendered these assets a logistical nightmare. What do you do with 3,970 of the world's most expensive bombers when the war they were built to win has vanished? The silence of August 15th was the loudest sound in the history of the U.S. Treasury. This is the strategic autopsy of the B-29's afterlife. It is a story of desert prisons, Soviet thefts, and the moment a superpower realized its most potent weapon was being sold for the price of a used car. In 1944, a single B-29 cost $639,000. That is roughly $11 million per airframe in modern capital. Multiply that by nearly 4,000 planes. You aren't just looking at an air force, you are looking at a tectonic shift in national wealth. The superfortress was a fortress of complexity. It featured the first fully pressurized crew compartments. It utilized analog computers to aim remote-controlled turret systems. It was a 60-ton computer with wings. The heart of the beast was the Wright R-3350 duplex cyclone engine. This was a masterpiece of unreliable brilliance. It produced 2,200 horsepower. It also featured magnesium crankcases that burned with the intensity of a sun when they overheated. Maintaining this fleet was a financial hemorrhage. The R-3350 engines required constant attention. They were prone to swallowing valves and catching fire on takeoff. By late 1945, keeping the B-29s operational cost the Army Air Forces $14 million every single month. The modification centers at Omaha, Birmingham, and Marietta were still churning out upgrades when the surrender was signed. Hundreds of planes were in various states of completion. The Pentagon performed a quick budgetary audit. They realized they were paying a billionaire's rent for a house they no longer needed to occupy. The B-29 possessed capabilities no other nation could dream of. It was the sole delivery system for nuclear deterrence. Yet, it was a gold-plated liability in a peacetime economy. Military planners faced a binary choice. They could maintain the fleet and go bankrupt, or they could prune the Air Force and risk a strategic void. The solution was Operation Sunset. The plan was to select the prime airframes and discard the rest. Aircraft with fewer than 200 flight hours were marked for retention. They would form the backbone of the nascent Strategic Air Command. The others were sent to the purgatory of the desert. They weren't being retired. They were being pickled. Technicians began sealing cockpits against the grit of the Arizona dust. They drained the fluids and sprayed the engines with protective compounds. The giants of the Pacific were being put to sleep. But the world was about to wake up to a Cold War. And some of these sleeping giants would soon be stolen by a man who didn't care about American receipts. Operation Sunset was the greatest aerial relocation in history. Between September 1945 and March 1946, over 1,800 superfortresses, began the long trek east. They left the coral strips of Tinian and Guam. They hopped through Hawaii. Then they landed in California. Crews called it the long flight home. But the home they found was a graveyard of silence. The Air Technical Service Command had picked the destinations with clinical precision. They needed dry air. They needed vast, cheap land. Piatt Army Airfield in Texas became the Rattlesnake Bomber Base. It eventually held 642 aircraft. Davis Monthan Field in Arizona offered alkaline soil that wouldn't sink under 60 tons of weight. Walnut Ridge in Arkansas took the overflow. The logistics were staggering. At Piatt alone, the bombers were parked wingtip to wingtip for miles. Storage was not a simple parking job. It was an engineering ritual known as pickling. Technicians drained the corrosive oils from the R-3350 engines. They replaced them with protective compounds. They sprayed the internal cylinder walls with wax. They sealed every cockpit seam against the desert grit. They taped over the plexiglass nose cones. These aircraft formed the reserve fleet. They were theoretically available for rapid reactivation, but the cost of this silence was high. Maintaining even a mothballed fleet required manpower. Guards patrolled the perimeters. Technicians checked the seals. By 1946, the Pentagon was auditing the utility of the giants. Technology was moving faster than the wind. The jet engine was no longer a rumor. It was a reality. The propeller-driven superfortress was becoming a relic before the desert dust even settled on its wings. The Air Force realized it didn't need 3,000 reserves. It needed a new breed of bomber. It needed the B-36 Peacemaker for range. It needed the B-47 for speed. The pickled fleet began to look like a mountain of scrap metal. But before the smelters could arrive, the B-29 was called for one final terrifying assignment. Some of these desert survivors were about to be flown into the center of a mushroom cloud. The military needed to know if the world's most expensive plane could survive its own payload. The audit was moving from the desert to the Bikini Atoll. In July 1946, the superfortress faced its most clinical test. The Pentagon launched Operation Crossroads. The goal was simple. The Navy and the Air Force wanted to see what an atomic bomb would do to a fleet of ships, and they wanted to see what the blast would do to the plane that dropped it. They selected B-29's for the role of laboratory rats. Some were used to drop the actual weapons. Others were modified into remote-controlled drones. These were the QB-29's. They were packed with sensors and cameras. They were flown by pilots in motherships miles away. The drones were flown directly into the radioactive mushroom clouds. The military needed data on air pressure and thermal radiation. A B-29, named Dave's Dream, dropped the Able bomb over Bikini Atoll. The aircraft had to perform a 155-degree diving turn the moment the bomb left the bay. The crew was testing the limits of the airframe. They had to outrun the shock wave of a 23-kiloton weapon. The data was sobering. The flash was brighter than 1,000 suns. The heat bubbled the silver paint on the fuselage. Inside the drones, instruments recorded the physical toll of the blast. The results proved that the B-29 was a survivor. Its heavy skin and robust design could handle the turbulence of an atomic explosion. But the audit revealed a more dangerous truth. While the plane survived the blast, it could not survive the radiation. The drones came back hot. They were contaminated with radioactive isotopes that could kill a crew in days. The B-29 had pioneered the delivery of nuclear war. Now, it was teaching the Air Force about the arithmetic of survival. It showed that the Silver Plate bombers were a one-way bridge to a new kind of war, a war where the weapon was more powerful than the vehicle that carried it. The Bikini tests cemented the B-29 as the premier tool of deterrence. It was no longer just a bomber. It was a strategic asset. This status made the superfortress the most wanted piece of technology in the world. While American generals were counting their drones in the Pacific, Joseph Stalin was conducting an audit of his own. He didn't have a B-29, but he had a plan to steal one. The silver plate secret was about to be cloned in a factory in the Ural Mountains. Joseph Stalin wanted a strategic hammer. By 1944, the Soviet Union was a land power with a massive army, but it was a maritime and aerial dwarf compared to the United States. Stalin watched the newsreels of the B-29 raids on Japan. He realized the Americans possessed a weapon that could strike anywhere on the globe. He needed that weapon. He didn't want to design it. He wanted to steal it. The opportunity arrived during the summer and winter of 1944. During high-altitude raids against Japanese-occupied Manchuria, 4 superfortresses suffered mechanical failures. They couldn't make it back to their island bases in the Pacific. They turned north. They headed for the nearest friendly territory, the Soviet Union. The first was Ramp Tramp. Then came the General H.H. Arnold Special. Soon, Ding Hao and Hebu's Hope joined them. The aircraft landed near Vladivostok. The American crews expected a hero's welcome. They were allies, after all. Instead, they were treated with a cold, bureaucratic silence. The Soviet Union was not at war with Japan in 1944. Under international law, they were required to intern the crews and the aircraft. But Stalin had no intention of following the spirit of the law. He had found his blueprint. Stalin issued an absolute directive to his premier aviation designer, Andrei Tupolev. He was to copy the B-29 exactly. He was not to improve it. He was not to tweak it. He was to duplicate it down to the last screw. This was Project 64. It would become the most ambitious reverse engineering project in human history. The aircraft were dismantled at Factory 22 in Kazan. This was a clinical operation. Every one of the 105,000 parts was removed, cleaned, and cataloged. Tupolev's team faced an immediate, staggering crisis. It was a crisis of measurements. The United States built the B-29 using the imperial system. They used inches, feet, and yards. The Soviet Union used the metric system. This wasn't just a matter of changing numbers on a page. It was a matter of industrial capability. American sheet metal was measured in thousandths of an inch. Soviet sheet metal was produced in millimeters. There was no direct equivalent. If the Soviets used thicker metal, the plane would be too heavy. It wouldn't fly. If they used thinner metal, the airframe would collapse under the pressure of high-altitude flight. Tupolev had to force the entire Soviet industrial complex to adapt. He had to create new standards for aluminum alloys. He had to invent new manufacturing techniques just to match the American skin. The complexity of the B-29 systems was another wall. The aircraft featured a remote control gun system. It used 5 analog computers to aim the turrets. The Soviets had never seen anything like it. They had to rebuild the vacuum tubes and the wiring from scratch. They had to replicate the Wright R-3350 engines. They created a clone called the Shvetsov Ash-73. The obsession with accuracy led to legendary stories. Technicians found a small hole in the wing of one of the captured B-29's. It was likely a mistake made by an American worker on the assembly line. The Soviet engineers, fearing Stalin's wrath, reproduced the hole in every single clone they built. They even copied the American repair patches. They replicated the Boeing logos on individual parts. By May 1947, the first clone took to the skies. It was the Tupolev Tu-4. The Americans were unaware of the theft until the Tushino Air Show in August 1947. 3 bombers flew over the crowd. The American observers assumed they were the captured B-29's. Then, a 4th bomber flew over, then a 5th. The realization hit the Western attachés like a physical blow. The Soviets weren't just flying captured planes. They were mass-producing them. The Americans gave the Tu-4 the reporting name Bull. By 1952, the Soviets had built 847 of these clones. They had effectively skipped a decade of research and development. Stalin now possessed a strategic force. The Bull could reach London, Paris, and Rome. On one-way missions, it could hit New York or Washington. The B-29 had created a nuclear bridge, but the bridge went both ways. The Americans had spent $3 billion to win a war. Stalin had spent a fraction of that to prepare for the next one. The theft of the superfortress accelerated the Cold War. It forced the United States to develop the B-36 and the B-47 jet bombers much faster than planned. But while the Soviets were celebrating their clone, the original B-29 was heading back to the front lines. The world had changed since 1945. Propeller-driven giants were about to meet a new predator. The Korean War was coming, and the superfortress was about to face its ultimate crisis. It was a crisis called the MiG-15. June 1950. The 38th parallel was shattered. The North Korean invasion was a strategic shock. For the B-29, it was a sudden resurrection. The pickled giants were pulled from their desert sleep. Technicians at Davis-Monthan worked around the clock. They peeled back the protective tape. They flushed the wax from the engines. By August 1950, nearly 100 superfortresses were deployed to Okinawa and Japan. Many of these airframes had dropped firebombs on these very same cities 5 years earlier. Now, they were flying from them. The mission was interdiction. The goal was to dismantle the North Korean infrastructure. For the first few months, the B-29 ruled the skies. It was 1945 all over again. They flew in daylight. They flew in tight formations. They leveled bridges and rail yards with clinical precision. But the arithmetic of war had shifted. In November 1950, a swept-wing shadow appeared over the Yalu River. It was the MiG-15. The MiG-15 was a Soviet-built jet. It was fast. It was agile. Most importantly, it carried 23mm and 37mm cannons. The B-29 was a propeller-driven relic. It was a target. The crisis peaked on April 12, 1951. History remembers it as Black Thursday. 36 B-29s headed for the Senwiju bridges. They were intercepted by 30 MiGs. In minutes, the sky was full of burning aluminum. 3 B-29s were shot down. 7 more were heavily damaged. The bombers' remote-controlled 50-caliber guns were useless against the speed of a jet. The audit was final. The era of the high-altitude, daylight propeller bomber was dead. The Air Force pulled the B-29 from daylight operations. They were relegated to night bombing. They were painted black on their bellies. They hunted by the light of the moon. Korea proved that the B-29 was no longer a strategic hammer. It was a stopgap. It was a machine out of time. By the end of the conflict in 1953, the superfortress had flown 21,000 sorties. It had dropped 167,000 tons of ordnance. It was a staggering contribution, but it was also a farewell. The Air Force knew that the next war would be fought at the speed of sound. While the Americans were retiring their veterans, the British were just starting to learn the language of the superfortress. The RAF had a nuclear gap to fill. They needed a bridge to the jet age. They turned to the B-29. They gave it a new name, the Washington. By 1950, the Royal Air Force was facing a strategic void. The British Empire was a nuclear power without a nuclear delivery system. Their primary heavy bomber was the Avro Lincoln. It was essentially a Lancaster with a facelift. It was slow. It was unpressurized. The Lincoln was a relic. It could not reach Moscow. It could not carry the massive Blue Danube atomic bomb Britain was developing. The British needed a bridge to the future. They needed the B-29. Under the code name Operation Ruby, the United States agreed to lease 88 superfortresses to the RAF. The British didn't call it a B-29. They gave it a name that sounded like a capital city, the Washington B Mark I. The first aircraft arrived at RAF Marham in March 1950. For the British crews, the Washington was a revelation. It had heaters. It had pressurized cabins. It had ashtrays. It was a flying hotel compared to the cold, cramped cockpits of the Lincoln. But the honeymoon was short. The British quickly learned about the arithmetic of the R-3350 engine. The Wright engines were masterpieces of heat and failure. British maintenance crews were used to the reliability of the Rolls-Royce Merlin. The Washington required 4 times the man-hours to keep in the air. The RAF equipped 8 squadrons with the Washington. Squadrons like 35, 90, and 115 became the core of Britain's strategic deterrent. They practiced high-altitude nuclear strikes. They participated in massive NATO exercises, like Exercise Mainbrace. They flew long-range patrols over the North Sea, staring toward the Soviet horizon. But the Washington was always an interim bomber. It was a placeholder. British engineers were already perfecting the V-bombers. The Valiant, the Vulcan, and the Victor were the true future of the RAF. They were jet-powered. They were faster than anything the B-29 could dream of. By 1954, the lease was up. The first Vickers Valiants were entering service. The British began returning the Washingtons to the United States. They were flown back to Davis-Monthan. They were parked in the same desert silence they had been pulled from 4 years earlier. Of the 88 aircraft, the British returned 70. The others had been lost to accidents or mechanical failure. The RAF experience proved that the B-29 was a global currency. It was the only machine that could buy a nation entry into the nuclear club in the early 1950s. But while the bombers were being returned, the B-29 airframe was beginning a second, more specialized life. It wasn't just a carrier of bombs anymore. It was becoming a carrier of technology. The superfortress was evolving into the mothership. By the mid-1950s, the B-29 was no longer a frontline hammer, but the Air Force realized the airframe was a versatile laboratory. The superfortress didn't die. It evolved. The most critical evolution was the KB-29 tanker. Jet engines were thirsty. The B-47 and B-52 needed fuel to reach the USSR. The B-29 was converted into a flying gas station. Early versions used a grappling line system. It was clumsy and dangerous. Engineers soon developed the flying boom. This became the standard for every American tanker for the next 70 years. The Air Rescue Service saw a different potential. They created the SB-29. It carried a massive 30-foot A-1 lifeboat under its belly. This boat was dropped by parachute to down crews in the freezing ocean. The Weather Service needed eyes in the storm. The WB-29 was the answer. These hurricane hunters flew directly into the eyes of cyclones. They collected data that saved thousands of lives on the ground. Perhaps the most iconic role was the mothership. The B-29 was the only plane capable of carrying the Bell X-1. The X-1 was the needle-nosed rocket that would break the sound barrier. It sat in the modified bomb bay of a B-29 named Fertile Myrtle. Chuck Yeager didn't take off from a runway. He dropped from the belly of a superfortress at 30,000 feet. The B-29 provided the altitude. The X-1 provided the speed. But even these specialized roles had an expiration date. The C-135 and the B-50 were faster. They were more reliable. The B-29 was becoming an expensive maintenance nightmare. The spare parts were vanishing. The R-3350 engines were still at fire risk. The Air Force made the final, clinical decision. The remaining fleet was ordered to report for its final audit. The destination was the desert, but this time there would be no pickling. There would be no protective tape, only the heat of the blast furnace. The end of the B-29 was not heroic, it was industrial. By 1955, the strategic audit was complete. The jet age had arrived. The propeller-driven giant was now a liability. It was taking up space. It was costing money. The Air Force issued the final order: total liquidation. The bombers were flown to Davis-Monthan in Arizona. They weren't there for storage this time. They were there for the chop shop. Civilian contractors purchased the aircraft in bulk. They didn't see the machines that won the war. They saw 60 tons of premium raw materials. The purchase price was a clinical insult. A plane that cost $639,000 was auctioned for $3,000. That is a recovery rate of less than 0.5%. Teams of workers moved in with torches and hydraulic shears. They stripped the precious metals first. They harvested miles of copper wiring from the fuselage. They removed the silver-plated contacts from the complex analog computers. The engines were pulled and sold for parts or melted down for their magnesium. This was a brutal arithmetic. The R-3350 engines, which had been the pinnacle of power in 1944, were now just heavy obstacles to be cleared. The massive aluminum airframes were sliced into manageable chunks. They were fed into the smelter. The smelting process was a factory of erasure. The high-grade aluminum was heated until it turned into a silver liquid. The dreams of world dominance were poured into standard molds. At the peak of the disposal in 1956, Davis-Monthan was processing 15 B-29's every week. The desert was filled with the sound of grinding metal and the roar of the furnaces. By the time the smelters were done, thousands of superfortresses had simply vanished. They were transformed into standard industrial ingots. The silver plate bombers were recycled into the domestic economy. The bomber that destroyed an empire became the siding on a suburban house. It became the foil in the kitchen. It became the pistons in a civilian car. By 1960, the fleet was gone. 3,970 planes had been built. Fewer than 50 survived the fire. The Air Force struck the final B-29 from the inventory. The silence was absolute. The military had moved on to the B-52 and the nuclear missile. The propeller age was buried in the Arizona sand. But history has a way of hiding in the corners of the world. A few airframes had escaped the furnace. They were forgotten in the weeds of remote bases. Some were abandoned on Navy bombing ranges in California. Others were tucked away in the back of museums that couldn't afford to fix them. These survivors would eventually become the most expensive restoration projects in aviation history. The audit was moving from the smelter to the museum. By 1960, the superfortress was a ghost. Exactly 3,970 had been built. Fewer than 22 remained substantially complete. The most famous survivors are the atomic bombers. Enola Gay went to the Smithsonian. For decades, it sat in a warehouse, a victim of political debate. Today, it sits at the Udvar Hazy Center, polished and silent. Boxcar went to the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force in Ohio. They are the clinical bookends of the war. They are preserved as monuments to the moment the world changed. But for the rest, the afterlife was a struggle. For decades, the others sat in the weeds of remote airfields. They were used as targets for ground troops. They were scavenged by hobbyists for parts. Then came the restorers. They were men who spoke the forgotten dialect of the R-3350 engine. In 1971, the commemorative Air Force found a B-29 sitting at a Navy base at China Lake. It was being used as a target. They rescued it from the scrap heap and named her Fifi. For 40 years, she was the only airworthy superfortress in the world. Restoring Fifi was a $1 million gamble. It required fabricating parts that hadn't been made since the 1940s. It required thousands of volunteer hours. In 2016, a second giant woke up. Doc was a radar trainer found in the Mojave Desert. It had been used as a target for decades. It was a hollow shell, filled with sand and birds' nests. It took 16 years and millions of dollars to make him speak the language of flight again. The restoration was a surgical operation. Every rivet had to be inspected. Every wire had to be replaced. When Doc finally took off from Wichita, it was the first time two B-29's had shared the sky in over half a century. Today, these two aircraft are the only flying relics of a $3 billion empire. They tour the country drawing crowds of thousands. People stand in line just to hear the roar of the engines. They are not just planes. They are flying adults of an era that changed the world. They represent the peak of a civilization's industrial will. They are the last witnesses to the day the propeller gave way to the jet. The B-29 was the bridge to the modern world. It birthed the Strategic Air Command. It established the doctrine of nuclear deterrence that defined the 20th century. It fathered the jet-powered Boeing 707 and the global airline industry. The pressurized cabins we enjoy today were born in the cold skies over Japan. It even taught the Soviet Union how to build a strategic threat through the theft of its own technology. But its greatest lesson is the arithmetic of obsolescence. Military power is a temporary currency. It is a language that is constantly being rewritten. The B-29 was the most advanced weapon in human history in 1945. It was the absolute peak of American genius. By 1955, it was being sold for its weight in aluminum. It was a relic before its youngest pilots had reached middle age. In the dialect of power, the winner is the one who understands when the tool is spent. The true professional knows that today's miracle is tomorrow's scrap. History isn't just about the victories on the map. It is about what we do with the machines when the smoke clears. It is the story of how the giants of the Pacific became the siding on our houses. It is a reminder that even the greatest empires are built on tools that eventually vanish. If this strategic autopsy of the superfortress was compelling, acknowledge the data by liking this video. Your support is the raw material that keeps this channel running. Subscribe for more stories of the engineering of power and the ghosts of technology. Leave a comment. Was the $3 billion investment worth it for a decade of service? Or was the B-29 always destined to be a one-way bridge to the jet age? Thank you for watching, and thank you for demanding the whole story.